They bury their dead off in the desert where they would mostly remain untouched. And we can get glimpses of these people and what they owned because they were buried with some of the things they owned. And it gets more and more obsessive. And that's why tombs become so important. And
but you were there in Egypt with him, which was curious to me because like that's not necessarily what's supposed to be his area of expertise. Sure. But seeing as he's a Rome guy and Rome conquered Egypt and had it as a state and basically admired all the history there and put their own bend on it, I guess he was there basically teaching all of that stuff specifically. Is that right?
Yeah. So it was a great excuse to go on that tour with him to see two things at once. I was taking a tour of Egypt, which I had already studied, and I kind of understood a broad context of all the places that we visited. But the context that I didn't understand of the place we visited is how the Romans built on top of and tinkered with some of the ancient sites. I mean, really many of the ancient sites throughout Egypt. So I got like a Roman history expert's angle on ancient Egypt, which just, here's my view.
Yes.
His view is like this.
Added layer.
And it was an added layer to Egypt. And so it was just, I don't know, it just worked out perfectly to be able to go on that trip with him.
For people who aren't familiar with the history of ancient Rome vis-a-vis Egypt and everything, can you just explain like when they first came into Egypt and how all that went down?
Yeah, so okay, so why don't I back up a little bit further and kind of go through Egypt, I guess.
Let's do it.
Sense. Okay.
Let's learn. Come on, Professor.
So we can dive into particulars later on, but I'll give you like a very broad sweep. All right. So let's go to the Sahara Desert 10,000 years ago. Keep me on track.
10,000.
Keep me on track for getting back to Rome, okay? Because
you're going back 10,000 years.
This is going to be a very broad, short history, but we can dive into certain sections if you want to.
Let's do it.
So, northern Africa, Egypt exists on the northeastern part of Africa. It is the bridge between Africa and the Near East or the Middle East.
Yes.
And so 10,000 years ago, the Nile would have been very green. This is kind of why I am very hesitant towards people in this modern day Atlantis hunt looking for evidence of Atlantis in Egypt, because there were other places in northern Africa to build a huge civilization. You had multiple Great Lakes in Africa. I mean, gigantic. I think that the world's biggest lakes were in Africa during this African humid period, and it was just this period where the the African continent, where the Sahara Desert is today, it was a green Sahara. It kind of went back and forth between, a drought to a swamp, kind of, sort of like this large green lush savanna. And over time, around it's either 8,000 years ago or 8,000 BC, it starts to dry up pretty rapid, slowly becoming more rapidly. And then do
we know what caused that?
It's outside of my expertise, what causes things like that. But around 4,000 BC, people who were living in this green Sahara, or the descendants of the people who once lived in this great green Sahara, had two choices to make. They could either go south into where the African savannas are today, or they could go east to live along the Nile. And along the Nile, you have these two very narrow strips of tropical oasis land. And the reason that happens is because every year the Nile overflows its banks. And so it basically inundates the banks. And so what it does is it brings this rich black topsoil and it soaks the desert sand. And from that blooms everything that a civilization needs. And it blooms in a great, great quantity. That quantity right there gave birth to the Egyptian civilization. That is why Egypt even exists. Egypt, it just wouldn't really make sense for Egypt to exist 10,000 years ago, because people needed to be pushed to live along the Nile in very close quarters to each other. So you can't build out, you have to build up. So you start building mud brick buildings, right? And civilization starts to rise. It's kind of like New York City. You only have so much space, so you build up eventually.
That's right.
And that forces, it's a funnel that forces productivity. It's either all going to fall apart or it's going to be overwhelmingly successful. In Egypt's case, it was overwhelmingly successful. And so they start building up. Now, this is 4000-ish BC. And so you have 4000 BC to 3000 BC. And even before 4000 BC, we can go 4500, maybe even 5000 BC. That's kind of this early prehistory, very remote, mystical part of Egypt where, the remnants of it are so low under the ground, have been built over so many dozens of times that we can only kind of get glimpses of who these people were. And we'll get to how we get those glimpses through their tombs, because they would bury their dead off in the desert. That's why tombs are so important in Egypt. They bury their dead off in the desert where they would mostly remain untouched. And we can get glimpses of these people and what they owned because they were buried with some of the things they owned. And it gets more and more obsessive. And that's why tombs become so important. And it's why it was important to the Egyptians. It's why it's important to Egyptologists looking back through time. But let's say about 3500 BC, Egypt is starting to form into two different civilizations. You have northern Egypt, you have southern Egypt. And they have two different, they essentially have two different religions at the time with not entirely different religions, but just different gods that they hold, to a higher esteem. And at some point around 3100 BC, a king named Narmer travels up from southern Egypt to northern Egypt, and he smites the king of northern Egypt and pulls both civilizations together.
And he smites them.
Yeah, that's the word. And so it's this smiting pose that is known throughout Egypt, and all the pharaohs depict themselves this way because of Narmer, because he depicted himself this way. It was on a slate palette that was found in I think the city Hierakonpolis, which is not the ancient name of the city; it's the Greek name, Hierakonpolis. And it's this slate palette about this big. I was really excited to see it in person. It's about this big, and essentially it depicts a pharaoh wearing the combined pharaoh's crown. So you have the white crown, which is the crown of southern Egypt. I'm using southern and northern because it's simpler to understand, because in Egypt it's reversed. Upper Egypt is in the south, lower Egypt is in the north. So I'm going to use north and south instead because it's easier to understand. But he's wearing the southern white crown. And the southern white crown becomes fused with the northern red crown. You probably pull up an example of this. It's pretty cool. But there are these two crowns that fit perfectly together. It's like you can put on both crowns at the same time, and they complement each other. So he's now wearing both of them on the Narmer palette, and he has this scepter in his hand with this God, I'm trying to think of the word. It's essentially a mace head on the end of his a mace head on the end of his scepter. So you have this long scepter, probably made out of a cedar of Lebanon. A very hard piece of wood that maybe you soak in water a little bit to make it even harder, and then you have a stone, probably a dolerite mace head, which is that hardest stone in Egypt, and essentially you would grab your opposing ruler by his head and you smash his head in, and that's smiting.
Oh, that's nice.
It's smiting a king.
Love that.
And so that is the iconic pose for all of pharaohs, and it sets a precedence for the rest of ancient Egypt. Now, just stopping for one moment and looking slightly before 3100 BC, there was a lot happening there, but when we try to look back into it, we have very little understanding of this time. One of the most miraculous things that they were doing is before the Great Unification, 3100 BC, like I was telling you, King Narmer smites the king of northern Egypt and unifies it. And unifying the two lands together caused an explosion of productivity and civilization. I mean, that's when Egypt just really begins. But they were very productive in accomplishing a lot before that. And we know that because of the richness of their tombs. So you look back about 3200 BC, you're seeing people being buried with all kinds of hard stone artifacts, which is this vase hype, around these hard stone vases made out of granite and diorite. Just an incredible testament to the stonemasons that existed in ancient Egypt, and something that is never replicated again beyond this point in Egypt. That we don't really know why that is. It's after the unification of Egypt, 3100 BC. For some reason, the creation of these hard stone vases just ends, and we see a lot of people pre-dynastic. So pre-dynastic would be before 3100 BC. Dynastic would be everything after that, up until Cleopatra's death and the annexation of Egypt under the Roman Empire. these pre-dynastic tombs are very rich with these hardstone vases. Afterwards, we still see the hardstone vases, and they're being buried with people, but they're being buried with people more like heirlooms. You know, this is something that belonged to my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, however many, you know, an unknown number of centuries ago, and it's important to me and important to my family. I'm going to bury myself with it. So from 3100 BC until 2100 BC, the collapse of the Old Kingdom. So you have three different kingdoms in Egypt. We're about to get to this. But up until Egypt's very first collapse, about 1,000 years after they're first united, up until that point, we see a steady decline in the number of these hardstone vases appearing in tombs. So we know that they have stopped making them, and then slowly but surely, people are buried with all of them, and then they're gone at the end of 2100 BC. So that's kind of the context of those vases. Now, after the unification of Egypt, we go through this sort of this dark period from 3100 BC to 3000, 29, 28, 2700 BC. It's kind of this primordial area of ancient Egypt that we don't really know a lot about.
Why is that? They just didn't
Probably,
didn't record anything?
Well, they were recording things, but it gets lost over time, you know. The artifacts, it seems that that pallets was the thing that they used to record big events on. And these are, like I was telling you, it's this slate palette where they carve these very, I say primitive, but primitive compared to what Egyptian hieroglyphs become later on. There's these primitive early drafts of what hieroglyphs are eventually going to become. They carve these on pallets, and these pallets that are a foot tall get lost, but they're kept, we assume that they're kept in government buildings, kind of like museums, you know. The Egyptians had museums of that recorded their history.
Watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.